Imagine being a maintenance worker showing up for what you expect to be just another ordinary Tuesday on the job. You pull up the driveway of a sprawling property in Santa Fe, New Mexico, clipboard in hand, ready to fix a pipe or check an appliance. But something immediately feels off. The front door is wide open. The grounds look abandoned. And when you step inside, what you discover changes everything you thought you knew about the quiet life of one of Hollywood's greatest legends. This is not a movie. This is not a screenplay. This is the real story of what happened inside Gene Hackman's mansion, and the shocking details that have left investigators, fans, and the entire world stunned. Stay with us, because this story is unlike anything you've heard before. Gene Hackman. The name alone brings to mind some of the most powerful performances ever put on film. He was the relentless detective Popeye Doyle in The French Connection. He was the cunning, darkly funny Lex Luthor in Superman. He was Little Bill Daggett in Unforgiven, the kind of villain you almost rooted for. He was a man who could make you feel everything from terror to laughter within the span of a single scene. But when the news broke that Gene Hackman had been found dead inside his New Mexico home, alongside his wife, Betsy Arakawa, the world stopped. Not just because a legend was gone, but because of how he was found. And what was found around him. The details that have emerged from inside that mansion have sent shockwaves through Hollywood, through law enforcement circles, and through the hearts of millions of fans who grew up watching this man on screen. Today, we're going to walk you through everything: the discovery, the investigation, the unanswered questions, the life Gene Hackman lived behind closed doors, and the extraordinary legacy he leaves behind. This is the full story. It was supposed to be a routine visit. Two maintenance workers arrived at Gene Hackman's large property in Santa Fe, New Mexico, expecting to do what they always did: some regular upkeep, maybe fix something small, and be on their way. But from the moment they pulled up, something didn't feel right. The front door of the home was standing wide open. Not slightly ajar. Wide open, as if someone had left in a hurry, or as if no one had been around to close it at all. On the grounds, two dogs were running loose. That alone wasn't necessarily alarming. But combined with the open door and the eerie stillness hanging over the property, the workers grew concerned. They stepped inside. What they found inside that house would haunt them. The bodies of Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy Arakawa were discovered inside the home. And the condition in which they were found made it immediately clear that they had not been there alone, in the living sense, for quite some time. The level of decomposition was severe. Investigators who arrived on the scene were visibly shaken. These were professionals trained to handle death, people who had seen things most of us never will. And even they were not prepared for what was inside that house. One law enforcement source described the scene as something that didn't seem real at first. Another said it was as if time had simply frozen inside those walls, that the world outside had kept moving while everything inside had stopped, long before anyone realized it. Gene Hackman was found near the back of the house, close to a rear door. A cane and a pair of sunglasses were lying nearby, suggesting he had either fallen or collapsed in that spot. Betsy Arakawa, who was 63 at the time, was found in the bathroom on the opposite side of the home. Near her were scattered pills, an open prescription bottle, and a space heater that had been knocked over. And then there were the animals. Two dogs had survived. They were running outside when the maintenance workers arrived, which suggests food or water may have been accessible somewhere on the property for a while. But inside the house, in a crate, there was a third dog. And that dog had not survived. That detail hit people hard. The idea that a beloved pet had died alone and unnoticed, locked in a crate inside the home of one of the most famous actors in Hollywood history, underscored just how long the couple had been gone before anyone came looking. The question everyone immediately began asking was, how long? How long had they been there? How had no one noticed? How had no one checked on them? In the early hours after the discovery, investigators were cautious but steady in their public statements. There were no obvious signs of a break-in. No doors or windows showed signs of being forced. No clear physical injuries were visible on either body. Authorities initially pointed toward natural causes as the most likely explanation, and carbon monoxide poisoning was floated as an early theory, particularly given that it can strike quietly and without warning, leaving victims unable to call for help. The New Mexico Gas Company was called in to inspect every gas line on the property. They did a thorough sweep. And they found absolutely nothing. No leaks. No malfunctions. Nothing that could have produced the kind of toxic buildup that would explain 2 deaths simultaneously. That result changed things. Investigators quietly shifted their language. What had been described as a tragic but seemingly explainable situation began to be characterized differently. The word suspicious entered the official vocabulary. A full investigation was launched. And as more details leaked out, the questions multiplied. Why were the bodies found in separate rooms? Gene near the back door, Betsy in the bathroom. If something had happened to one of them suddenly, why wasn't the other person nearby? What was the space heater doing knocked over on the bathroom floor? What were the pills scattered across the counter? And were they related to the cause of death? Why had no one, no neighbor, no friend, no family member, raised an alarm sooner?
Experienced investigators who spoke on background noted that the scene was deeply unusual. When 2 people die in the same home at approximately the same time, there is almost always a clear, identifiable cause. A gas leak. A fire. A violent event that leaves evidence behind. What investigators found in the Hackman home didn't fit neatly into any of those categories, and that made it one of the strangest cases many of them had encountered in their careers. One seasoned investigator put it plainly: 2 people do not simply fall over dead at the same time without a major cause. It doesn't happen. And when it does appear to happen, you look very, very carefully at everything. Autopsies were ordered. Toxicology reports were requested. Phone records, medical histories, and email communications were pulled for review. Investigators wanted to know what Gene and Betsy's final days looked like, who they had spoken to, whether either of them had been to a doctor recently, and whether anyone had been inside that home before the maintenance workers arrived. As the investigation continued, the public, and the press, began piecing together what might have happened. Several theories emerged, and each one carries weight, even if none of them fully explains every detail. The first and most widely discussed theory is that the 2 of them died of natural causes, but at different times and in different ways. Gene Hackman was 95 years old. He had been dealing with heart issues for decades. His doctor had warned him years earlier that his heart couldn't handle sustained stress. It's entirely plausible, some experts suggested, that he suffered a cardiac event near the back door of his home, perhaps while coming in from outside. He collapsed. His cane and sunglasses fell nearby. Betsy, discovering him, or perhaps not even aware of what had happened to him because she was in another part of the house, may then have experienced her own medical crisis. The pills near her body could have been medication she was taking for a legitimate condition. The open bottle could simply mean she had reached for something to help her through a moment of panic or distress, not that she had taken anything harmful on purpose. The space heater knocked over on the bathroom floor adds a different layer. Had she fallen? Had she felt suddenly unwell and reached for the wall before collapsing? The physical details suggest a loss of balance or a sudden loss of consciousness, but without more information, it's impossible to say for certain. A second theory, which investigators have not ruled out, is that one of them died first, and the other, consumed by grief or shock or simply unable to cope, chose not to go on. This kind of event, known in medical literature as a broken heart death or, in more extreme cases, as a simultaneous or near-simultaneous voluntary death, is rare but documented. Elderly couples who have spent decades together sometimes die in very close proximity to one another, with no violence involved. But this theory runs into a problem. In situations where a person makes a conscious decision to end their own life, there is typically evidence, a note, a particular arrangement of the surroundings, medications taken in a deliberate pattern. None of those markers appear to have been clearly present in the Hackman home. And the fact that the two were found on opposite sides of the house, rather than together, makes this explanation feel incomplete. A third theory, and one investigators have been careful not to dismiss outright, is that someone else was involved. The open front door is the key detail here. It could simply mean that one of them had gone to the door and became too ill to close it. Or it could mean something else. Investigators noted that there were no signs of forced entry, but that doesn't rule out the possibility that someone they knew had visited the property and left the door open on the way out. Whether that person was a friend, a caretaker, or someone with harmful intentions, no one yet knows. Phone records and surveillance from nearby properties are reportedly being reviewed. Neighbors and regular visitors to the estate have been interviewed. The investigation is ongoing. When Gene Hackman's family came forward to address his passing, they did so with grace and unmistakable grief. His daughters Elizabeth and Leslie, along with his granddaughter Annie, released a statement describing him not as the legend the world knew, but simply as their father and grandfather. His loss leaves an emptiness that words cannot fill, the family said. We are truly devastated. Leslie Hackman spoke more personally in an interview, sharing details about her father's health and daily life that surprised many people. She said that despite being 95 years old, Gene Hackman had still been active and engaged in his physical well-being. He did Pilates. He did yoga. Multiple times a week, he was moving his body and taking care of himself. Leslie said that there were no major warning signs, no dramatic hospital visits in the months leading up to his death. He wasn't bedridden. He wasn't in a state of obvious decline. That's part of what made the news so hard to process, she explained. His death at 95, while not entirely unexpected given his age, still caught them off guard because he had seemed, in relative terms, to be doing well. And then there was the matter of Betsy. Betsy Arakawa was 63 years old, more than 3 decades younger than her husband. To lose her at the same time felt, to the family, like a second tragedy layered on top of the first. Leslie described Betsy as someone who had been deeply dedicated to Gene's well-being, a constant caretaker who watched over his health, accompanied him everywhere, and gave him a sense of stability and joy in his retirement years. Betsy took very good care of him, Leslie said. For that, I am really grateful. And I am very sad that she is gone. Elizabeth Hackman, Gene's other daughter, had initially suggested to media outlets that carbon monoxide could be the explanation, a theory that made sense to the family partly because it would explain 2 deaths without any signs of violence. A silent, odorless killer that strikes everyone in a home without warning. But as investigators cleared that possibility, the family, like everyone else, was left without easy answers. To understand Gene Hackman fully, you have to understand where he came from. Because his story is not the story of a man born into privilege or handed opportunity. It's the story of someone who was told, repeatedly, directly, that he didn't have what it takes, and who quietly, stubbornly proved every single one of those people wrong. Gene Hackman was born in 1930 in San Bernardino, California. His childhood was not easy. His father left the family when Gene was young, and his mother later struggled to hold things together. By his early teens, Gene had essentially been left to find his own way. He eventually joined the Marines, serving for several years before returning to civilian life with no clear plan and no clear path. Acting wasn't even something he considered seriously at first. But something drew him toward it, and he eventually enrolled at the Pasadena Playhouse, one of the most respected acting schools in the country. Here's where the story gets almost poetic in its irony. His classmates at the Pasadena Playhouse voted him, along with a fellow student named Dustin Hoffman, as the 2 least likely to succeed. Think about that for a moment. Gene Hackman and Dustin Hoffman, 2 of the greatest actors of the 20th century, voted least likely to succeed. By people who were supposedly studying the craft of performance. If that doesn't tell you something about the unpredictability of talent and determination, nothing will. Hackman was undeterred. He moved to New York and spent years scraping by, auditioning constantly, getting rejected constantly, taking tiny roles in television and theater just to keep himself in the game. There were moments, many of them, where a less determined man would have walked away. But Hackman didn't walk away. He kept showing up. He kept working. He kept getting better. His breakthrough came gradually and then all at once. Small television appearances gave way to a larger film role, and then in 1967, everything changed. He appeared in Bonnie and Clyde as Buck Barrow, Clyde's warm, tragic brother, and audiences and critics alike immediately recognized that something special was on screen. He was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. He didn't win, but the nomination announced him to the world. For years later, he won the whole thing. The French Connection, released in 1971, is one of the great crime films in American cinema history. And at the center of it is Gene Hackman's Popeye Doyle, a detective who is tenacious, flawed, morally complicated, and completely riveting in every single scene. Hackman won the Academy Award for Best Actor and cemented himself as one of the defining film performers of his generation. What followed was one of the most impressive bodies of work in Hollywood history. The Conversation, where he played a paranoid surveillance expert spiraling into guilt and isolation. Scarecrow, where his unlikely friendship with Al Pacino produced one of the more underrated performances of the decade. Night Moves, a noir thriller that showcased just how well he could carry quiet, internal anguish. Superman, where he played Lex Luthor with such charm and wit that he made the villain one of the most entertaining parts of a movie that had plenty of competition for that title. And then, in 1992, he won his second Oscar. Unforgiven, directed by Clint Eastwood, features Hackman as Little Bill Daggett, a sheriff who is simultaneously a monster and, in his own warped way, a man of principle. It's a performance of enormous complexity, and it earned him the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. He became one of the rare actors to win Oscars in both the lead and supporting categories. Beyond the awards, what made Hackman extraordinary was his range. He could play menace and warmth in the same film. He could be funny, genuinely, naturally funny, not in a forced way, and then turn around and wreck you emotionally in the next scene. Get Shorty, The Royal Tenenbaums, Crimson Tide, Absolute Power, every decade brought new evidence of his versatility and his willingness to take risks. He appeared in over 80 films across his career. He never phoned it in. Even in movies that didn't deserve him, he showed up fully. That was just who he was. In 2004, Gene Hackman stepped away from acting. He didn't make a grand announcement about it. He didn't give a farewell tour. He simply stopped taking roles, and over time it became clear that he wasn't coming back. In interviews, he was candid about the reasons. His heart, which had been a concern since his emergency angioplasty in 1990, was not in the shape it needed to be for the physical and emotional demands of film work. His doctor had told him as much. But beyond the medical reasons, Hackman seemed genuinely ready. He had said what he needed to say on screen. He had nothing left to prove. He was done. And so he went home. Literally home, to New Mexico, where he and Betsy had built a life away from the cameras and the red carpets and the industry events. He painted. He fished. He rode his bike. He and Betsy would watch old films together on weekends. He wrote books, historical fiction, westerns, crime novels, co-authoring several with an archaeologist friend and writing others entirely on his own. He described writing as a different kind of challenge than acting, one where the pressure was more internal, where you weren't surrounded by a crew waiting for you to perform, where the only deadline was the one you set for yourself. He seemed to genuinely love it. His public appearances became rare. He attended the Golden Globes in 2003 to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award, one of the few events that could draw him out of his New Mexico retreat. The last time most people saw him in public was outside a restaurant, sometime around 2023, where he and Betsy were photographed together. He looked thinner than people remembered. He was using a cane. But Betsy was right by his side, her arm linked with his, steady and present as always. In 2012, he had a scare when a pickup truck struck him from behind while he was riding his bicycle in Florida. He was 81 years old and not wearing a helmet. He was airlifted to a trauma center in Miami, which naturally caused widespread alarm. But his spokesperson clarified that the truck had only clipped him, and that the airlift was precautionary given that he was on an island and needed to be transported quickly. He was released after a few days with minor injuries. That was the last major public health incident on record before the events that led to his death. For most of his retirement, Gene Hackman was simply invisible in the best possible way, living quietly, privately, on his own terms, the way he had always preferred it. When news of Gene Hackman's death spread, and especially when the circumstances began to emerge, the reaction from Hollywood was immediate, emotional, and deeply personal. Clint Eastwood, who had worked alongside Hackman on Unforgiven and directed one of the greatest performances of his career, released a statement that was notably restrained in its language and enormous in its feeling. He said, simply, that no actor was more talented than Gene. That every performance was real. That every scene was powerful. That nothing Gene did on screen was ever less than perfect. And then he added something that cut through all the professional admiration and got to the human truth: Gene was a close friend, and he would miss him deeply. Gwyneth Paltrow, who appeared alongside Hackman in the Royal Tenenbaums, one of his final and most beloved films, shared a photo of the two of them together on social media. The image was from behind the scenes, casual and warm, the kind of photo that captures a real moment rather than a posed one. Tributes poured in from actors, directors, critics, and fans around the world. Many of them focused on the same thing: the feeling that Gene Hackman was always real. That when you watched him, you forgot you were watching an actor. He had a quality that is almost impossible to manufacture, a sense of absolute authenticity, of a man fully inhabiting every character he played. Film historians began pulling out quotes and assessments that had accumulated over decades. Critics who had reviewed his earliest films. Interview archives where Hackman talked about his approach to acting. What emerged was a portrait of a man who took the craft seriously but never took himself too seriously, who was skeptical of fame, wary of Hollywood culture, and genuinely more interested in the work than in what the work could get him. As of now, the full truth about what happened inside that New Mexico mansion has not been established. Autopsy results take time. Toxicology reports take even longer. Investigators are still reviewing evidence, still interviewing anyone who may have had contact with the couple in the weeks and months before their bodies were found. There are questions that may never be fully answered. How long were they there before the maintenance workers arrived? What exactly happened in those final hours, or days? Was there a moment, however brief, when either of them could have reached out, called for help, and didn't? Or was it all simply too fast, too sudden, too quiet? The open front door continues to haunt investigators. In the logic of a crime scene, an open door is a data point, but what it points toward is unclear. It could suggest that someone else was there. It could suggest that Gene or Betsy had opened it themselves, maybe for fresh air, maybe to call out to someone, maybe out of confusion or distress. It could simply mean the door was never properly latched that morning and swung open on its own. The pills found near Betsy in the bathroom are another loose thread. Were they her regular prescriptions? Were they taken in unusual quantities? Were they related to the cause of death at all? The toxicology report will likely provide the most important answers in this area. What investigators have been able to establish, at least preliminarily, is what did not happen. There was no carbon monoxide leak. There was no sign of forced entry. There were no obvious injuries suggesting violence. The space heater that was knocked over in the bathroom did not cause a fire or gas release. None of the dramatic possibilities that immediately leap to mind when you hear the word suspicious appear to be supported by the physical evidence. What remains is something more ambiguous and, in some ways, more unsettling. Two people, one of them very elderly, one of them middle-aged, died inside a large, quiet home in New Mexico, and no one noticed for what may have been days or weeks. The world kept turning. Hollywood kept making movies. And Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa lay undiscovered in the house they had shared for years. Gene Hackman once said, in one of his later interviews, that he wasn't afraid of dying. That the main thing he thought about was making sure his family was taken care of. That he didn't spend much time worrying about things he couldn't control. There's something very Gene Hackman about that. Direct. Unsentimental. Focused on what actually matters. What he left behind is not a mystery, even if the circumstances of his death still are. His legacy is right there on screen: 80+ films, 2 Oscars, decades of performances that will be studied and rewatched and talked about for generations. He showed people what it looked like to be a truly complete actor, someone who could be dangerous and kind, funny and devastating, larger than life and achingly ordinary, all depending on what the story required. He started out being told he wasn't good enough. That he didn't have the look or the talent or whatever indefinable quality Hollywood likes to say it's looking for. And then he spent 50 years proving that none of that matters if you're willing to work hard enough, take risks, and commit fully to every single thing you do. His films are the kind that hold up. The French Connection doesn't feel dated, it feels immediate. Unforgiven is as morally complex and emotionally powerful as anything made in recent decades. The Royal Tenenbaums gave an entirely new generation of moviegoers a window into what made Hackman so extraordinary. These are not just movies. They are documents of a man doing something remarkable with his gifts. And in his private life, for all the questions that still surround his death, what seems clear is that Gene Hackman built something real and meaningful. He left Hollywood on his own terms. He found a partner in Betsy who cared for him deeply and whom he loved. He wrote books. He painted. He fished. He lived a life that was, by his own standards, full. His daughter Leslie put it simply, to the world, he was Gene Hackman the legend. But to her and to their family, he was just Dad. And that is the version of him they will carry forward. The story of what was found inside Gene Hackman's mansion is still unfolding. Investigators are still working. Reports are still pending. The full truth of what happened in those final days and hours may take months to emerge, and there is a chance that some questions will never have definitive answers. But what we know right now is this: one of the greatest actors who ever lived spent his final years in quiet contentment in the New Mexico desert, far from the spotlight he had inhabited for half a century. He was cared for by a woman who loved him. He was remembered and mourned by children and grandchildren who knew him not as a movie star, but as family. And when the world finally found out he was gone, it stopped, if only for a moment, to acknowledge what had been lost. Not just a performer. Not just a famous face. But a genuinely irreplaceable presence in American cinema and in the cultural life of millions of people who had never met him but felt like they knew him anyway. That is the measure of a life well lived. And that is the legacy of Gene Hackman. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Drop a comment below and tell us, what is your favorite Gene Hackman movie? And which of his performances do you think deserves more recognition? Give this video a thumbs up if you found it worthwhile, and subscribe if you want to see more deep dives like this one. We'll see you in the next one.